I'd told myself 100 times that morning to just blend in, smile when spoken to, keep my hands folded, don't do anything that might embarrass Darren. My son's wedding day was supposed to be his perfect moment, and I was determined not to be the smudge on an otherwise pristine canvas. The reception hall glittered like something out of a royal documentary. Crystal chandeliers dripping with light, ivory silk tablecloths so smooth they looked poured, centerpieces taller than some of the guests. Each one a tangled sculpture of orchids and roses that probably cost more than my month's rent. Guests floated past me in designer gowns that whispered against the marble floors. I wore my best dress, navy blue, simple, bought years ago for special occasions that never quite materialized. Standing in that sea of couture, I might as well have been wearing a name tag that read, "I found my seat," tucked at the edge of the room with people I didn't recognize. Darren was across the hall, surrounded by the gleaming circle of his new in-laws. His tuxedo was perfectly cut, his hair styled to the millimeter. But when his eyes brushed over me, there was no warmth, just a polite acknowledgement, like spotting an acquaintance you're not sure you remember. It stung, but I swallowed it down with a sip of red wine. The toasts began. Norma, my daughter-in-law Calliope's mother, standing at the microphone in a gown that seemed to shimmer with its own light. Later, I'd learn it had been custom-made in Milan for a mere $45,000. At the time, I just thought she looked like someone who'd never been told no in her life. Her speech was polished, filled with sweet anecdotes about her daughter's childhood, sprinkled with just enough self-deprecating charm to keep the audience adoring her. I shifted in my seat, balancing my glass as the servers slipped through with refills. That's when it happened. Someone brushed hard against my shoulder from behind, maybe trying to squeeze past in the narrow gap between tables. My fingers jerked, the glass tilted, and the stem slipped from my hand. I reached out instinctively to grab it, but my hand snagged something else. The delicate, gossamer fabric of Norma's gown as she swept past my chair. I heard it before I saw it. A sound like paper tearing, sharp and final. Norma froze mid-step. The room's buzz thinned to nothing as every head turned toward the noise. I looked down and saw my fingers tangled in a jagged rip that ran along the side seam of her dress, silk threads fluttering like tiny white flags of surrender. My stomach plunged. Oh, I'm so sorry," I began, fumbling to release the fabric, my voice cracking. Before I could finish, Calliope's heels clattered across the floor. She took in the scene in one sweep, her gaze snapping from the tear to my face with pure, theatrical horror. "Pathetic old woman!" she shouted, loud enough to ricochet off the chandeliers. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Every conversation died mid-sentence. The clink of glassware ceased. I could feel 100 eyes pinning me to my chair. My cheeks burned so hot it felt like the skin might peel away. It was an accident," I stammered. "Someone bumped me." But she wasn't listening. Calliope jabbed a manicured finger toward the tear. "That gown was custom. Do you know what custom means? You don't just fix it with a sewing kit from the drugstore." Her voice rose on each syllable, her performance aimed at every witness in the room. And then Darren laughed. Not a nervous chuckle or a tense smile. No, he, tipping his head back as if he'd just heard the best joke of the evening. "Mom's always been a klutz," he announced to no one in particular, his words slicing through the silence. "Remember when she dropped my birthday cake? Some things never change." The guests chuckled politely, but the sound was brittle, like glass under too much pressure. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I wanted to sink through the marble floor. My hands, still trembling, hovered over the ruined fabric, unsure whether to try to help or just vanish. Norma turned slowly to face me, her expression a perfect portrait of disgust. "You've ruined it," she said coldly, as if pronouncing a sentence. "Leave it. Just leave it." I stood, my legs stiff and unsteady. No one moved to intercept me. No one said, "It's all right," or "Don't worry about it." I walked the long path across the ballroom, past the glittering tables and whispered comments, each step ringing in my ears. At the door, I glanced back once. Darren was already deep in conversation with his new in-laws, Calliope's hand possessively on his arm, her laughter replacing mine in the space he'd once reserved for me. I stepped into the cold night air, the heavy doors shutting behind me with a muffled thud. Outside, the city lights blurred through my unshed tears. I'd thought I was prepared for anything that day. I'd been wrong. That tear in Norma's gown wasn't the only thing that had split open in that room. Something inside me had ripped too, and I wasn't sure it could ever be sewn back together. Outsider laughed. I don't remember getting to my car. One moment I was standing on the curb outside the reception hall, the cold biting through my thin navy dress, and the next I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The street lamps threw long shadows across the hood, and the muffled thump of music from inside the hall followed me like an unwelcome ghost. My fingers still tingled where they'd torn that silk, and my cheek still burned. Not from a slap this time, but from Calliope's words echoing in my head. Pathetic old woman. I'd heard insults before in my life, but never one delivered so publicly, with such precision, like she'd been waiting for the perfect moment to fire it. I turned the key and drove, the city sliding past in streaks of light and darkness. Traffic lights blurred. I stopped at some, drifted through others, unsure if I was following the rules of the road or just muscle memory. I couldn't feel my feet pressing the pedals, only the cold hollow forming in my chest. Somewhere between the reception hall and my driveway, the humiliation began to ferment into something heavier. It wasn't just about the dress. It wasn't even just about Calliope. It was about Darren. My son. The boy I'd carried for 9 months, raised through scraped knees and chicken pox and lonely birthdays after his father left. The boy who used to look for me in every crowd, whose face would light up when I walked into a room. That boy wasn't in the reception hall tonight. The man in his place had looked at me with something closer to amusement than love, like I was a scene in a play he'd already grown tired of. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, but I didn't move. The house loomed ahead, dark and still, as if it already knew I was bringing something inside that didn't belong, something sour and corrosive. I sat there for a long time, my breath fogging the windshield. In the quiet, my mind replayed Darren's laugh, the way his voice had carried across the ballroom. Mom's always been a klutz, as if all the years I'd held him up, financially, emotionally, physically, meant nothing. As if my worth could be boiled down to a clumsy moment. Eventually, I forced myself to go inside. The air in the house was stale, untouched since I'd left that morning. My heels clicked against the hardwood, the sound unnervingly loud in the emptiness. I sank onto the couch without turning on the lights. The wedding invitation still sat on the mantel where I'd placed it months ago, its elegant script once a source of pride. Now it felt like a cruel joke, mocking me from across the room. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Hours passed like that, the shadows shifting as. The moon crawled across the sky. I couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind, but somewhere around the 50th replay, the sharp sting of embarrassment dulled, replaced by something deeper, heavier, and far more painful. Betrayal. That's what it was. Not just in the way Darren had failed to defend me, but in the way he'd joined in. That laugh, that easy dismissal, wasn't new. I realized with a jolt that it had been there before, in smaller moments I'd brushed aside. The sigh when I called him at work, The way he'd changed the subject when people asked what I did for a living. The subtle distance at family gatherings, like he was quietly separating me from the rest of his life. I'd told myself it was stress, that he was busy, that life had simply changed. But lying there in the dark, I saw it clearly for the first time. Life hadn't changed. He had. And maybe, just maybe, I'd been too blind, or too unwilling, to see it. At some point, I rolled onto my side and stared at the framed photos on the wall. Darren at 5, grinning with missing front teeth. Darren at 17, in his cap and gown, eyes bright with possibility. Darren at 25, holding a champagne glass at some corporate event. I'd been there for every one of those moments, even if I wasn't in the frame. Always just out of sight, holding the camera, making sure everything looked perfect for him. Tonight, I'd been in the frame all right, but not the way I'd ever wanted. The shame was still there, coiled in my stomach, but it had fused with something sharper. I thought about the way Calliope had looked at me, as if I were beneath her, an inconvenience she'd tolerated for Darren's sake. And I thought about how Darren had let her. No, encouraged her. Because defending me wouldn't have fit the picture they'd painted for their perfect evening. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I realized the truth that made my chest ache in a way humiliation never could. The love I thought was unshakable, the love between a mother and son, had already been fading long before tonight. Tonight had just stripped away the last layer of pretense. I wasn't Darren's safe place anymore. I wasn't even someone he respected. I was just an accessory he could set aside when it didn't match the rest of his life. When that truth settled in, I stopped trying to sleep. Instead, I lay there watching the first light of dawn creep into the room, and I made myself a silent promise. I didn't know what it would look like yet, but I wasn't going to pretend anymore. Not for him, not for Calliope, not for anyone. Something had died in that reception hall. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to see what could grow in its place. When Darren was 6 years old, his father left on a Tuesday morning. No fight, no warning, just a neatly packed suitcase by the door and a note that said he wasn't cut out for family life. I told Darren his dad had gone on a business trip, because how do you tell a little boy the person he loves most has decided not to love him back? That lie stretched into weeks, then months, until it became our quiet reality. From then on, it was just me and him against the world. I worked mornings at the factory, afternoons at the diner, and nights cleaning offices. My hands were always raw from chemicals, my feet swollen from standing 12 hours a day, but every paycheck meant Darren could have what I didn't. New shoes for school, little league fees, piano lessons, things that said, "You matter, you're worth it." When I couldn't afford something, I'd sell what little I had. My grandmother's locket went to pay for his baseball trip out of state. The ring my mother left me covered the down payment for his trombone when he decided band was his new passion. I told myself it was just stuff. He was my future. I kept scrapbooks of his achievements, every ribbon, every team photo. When he needed extra tutoring in math, I picked up Saturday shifts and stopped buying coffee on my way to work. When he wanted to join the debate team, I learned to sew so I could alter a thrift store suit to fit him. And for a while, it felt like he noticed. He'd hug me after games, leave thank you notes on the fridge, tell me I was the best mom in the world. But somewhere between high school and college, the thank yous got fewer. I told myself it was just him growing up. After all, teenagers weren't exactly famous for gratitude. By the time Darren started college, I'd saved enough to cover most of his tuition at State University. He told me it wasn't prestigious enough. I couldn't bear to see him disappointed, so I took out a loan against the house to help him transfer to a private school. I picked up weekend janitorial work, scrubbing floors while he studied in ivy-covered lecture halls. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so I could send him money for textbooks. When he came home junior year with Calliope on his arm, I wanted to like her. She was beautiful, polished, and confident in a way that made me feel like I'd walked into the wrong room. Her eyes swept over my little house, pausing on the secondhand furniture and mismatched dishes. "Your mother is so dedicated," she told Darren, her voice warm but edged, like dedication was a charming flaw. She was the kind of woman who could make a compliment sound like a reminder you'd fallen short. Over dinners, she'd drop comments that seemed harmless at first. "My mother always says successful men should surround themselves with success." Or, "It's so important to elevate your circle." She'd smile at me while saying it, but her eyes were always on Darren, planting little seeds. "I love how close you are to your mom," she'd add casually. "But don't you think it's time to establish some independence? My therapist says healthy boundaries are so important." Those words, healthy boundaries, became her favorite phrase. At first, they sounded reasonable. Who doesn't want a healthy relationship? But I started noticing the ways Darren's boundaries seemed to push me further out. Phone calls got shorter. Visits home were rushed. He'd tell me I wouldn't understand his new life, the pressures, the sophistication of the world he was entering. And maybe he was right. I didn't understand. I didn't understand how the boy who used to run into my arms after school now barely looked at me across the dinner table. I didn't understand how boundaries somehow always meant me giving more space, more time, more money, while he gave less of everything. Still, I kept giving. When Darren asked for help with a sure thing investment, I handed over $20,000 from my retirement fund. He promised to pay it back in 6 months. 6 months turned into a year, then 2, until he finally said, "That wasn't a loan, Mom. That was an investment in my future." The way he said it, patient, like he was explaining something obvious to a child, made me feel small. Calliope backed him up, of course. "That's what families do," she'd say. "They support each other." But the support only ever flowed one way. By the time they were engaged, I'd helped cover the honeymoon, chipped in for a down payment on their house, and contributed to emergency expenses that somehow never matched the stories I got. Calliope was always sweet about it, never directly asking, just hinting at needs and letting Darren close the deal. "You're investing in your grandchildren's future," she'd say, as if I were buying my ticket into their lives. And every time I opened my wallet, I told myself it was temporary, that one day they'd turn around and see everything I'd done. That day never came. Instead, the space between us grew, padded with polite calls on holidays and carefully curated visits where I felt more like a guest than a mother. Looking back now, I can see it started long before the tear in Norma's gown. The wedding wasn't the moment things broke. It was just the moment I stopped pretending they hadn't. If you'd asked me back then, I would have told you I was helping my son build his future. That's how I justified every check, every transfer, every time I dipped into savings I'd spent decades scraping together. It started small, $500 here, $1,200 there, for things that sounded urgent and important. A conference fee Darren had to cover to network for work, a shortfall on rent when he was between apartments, a car repair that turned out to be a down payment on a newer model. I told myself this was just what mothers did, but the asks got bigger, and my no's got fewer. The $20,000 investment opportunity was the first big hit. Darren called it a loan. He sat at my kitchen table, leaning forward with that earnest look he used to give me when he was 12 and wanted permission for a school trip. 6 months, Mom, with interest. You'll get it back and more." I remember nodding, signing the check, thinking how proud I'd feel when my boy paid me back, and I could tell friends he was a success. 6 months came and went. When I asked about it, he frowned like I'd misunderstood. "That wasn't a loan. That was you believing in me. You can't put a deadline on family support. Calliope chimed in later, her voice syrupy. My parents have always said you don't keep score in family. You give because you love. I wanted to believe that, so I swallowed the lump in my throat and let it go. Then came the wedding. Norma, Calliope's mother, was covering most of the costs, but there were extras they wanted. Live string quartet, custom invitations, a 5-star honeymoon in the Maldives. Darren asked if I could contribute to the honeymoon. Just so you feel part of it all. $15,000. My vacation fund. The money I'd been saving for years to maybe see Europe before my knees gave out. I told myself it was worth it to be part of their joy. To imagine the stories they'd tell their future kids about the trip their grandmother made possible. That's what I clung to. The image of grandchildren. Chubby hands in mine, giggles in my kitchen, someone to pass my traditions down to. Calliope dangled it in front of me like a carrot on a string. We're not ready yet, but when we are, you'll be such a big part of their lives. We want to raise them surrounded by family. Those words loosened the last bit of resistance in me. The down payment for their house was the next ask. $45,000. Years of careful saving, of skipping dinners out, of wearing my winter coat 2 extra seasons so I could stretch every dollar. It's really for the kids we'll have, Calliope said sweetly, hand resting on her flat stomach. They'll have a yard to play in, a safe neighborhood, good schools. I wrote the check and told myself it was an investment in my grandchildren's future, not a gift to people who already had more than I ever did. But with every dollar I gave, something shifted. I noticed it first in the way they spoke to me. Less gratitude, more expectation. When I visited, the tone was different, like they were doing me a favor by letting me into their schedule. I stopped getting invited to casual dinners or weekends away. Holidays were rotated between families, but somehow my turn came less often. The more I gave, the smaller I seemed to become in their eyes. My opinion didn't carry weight. My presence wasn't necessary. But my checkbook always was. Even my birthday one year was reduced to a quick lunch at a crowded cafe, where Darren spent most of the time answering work emails. No gift, no card, just a mention that they were stretched thin and couldn't do much that year. This, after I just helped them cover unexpected closing costs on the house. I told myself it was temporary, that once they were settled, they'd remember everything I'd done, that Darren would one day look at me and see not just the money, but the sacrifices behind it. I kept that hope alive with daydreams of babysitting, of baking cookies with my grandkids, of hearing them call me grandma. But the grandkids never came, and the calls came less often. The requests, though, never stopped. Sometimes they were dressed up as opportunities. Other times they were dressed up as emergencies. But always, they were dressed up as love. And I was so desperate to believe that love was still there, I kept paying the price. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. Each gift was a thread, and every time I handed one over, I tied myself tighter to people who were slowly pulling away. What I didn't realize then was that you can give and give until there's nothing left, and it still won't make someone value you. All it does is teach them that your worth is measured in what you can hand over, and I had taught Darren that lesson better than anyone. 3 weeks after the wedding, I was still moving through my days like a ghost. I'd wake up, make coffee, stare at the same 4 walls, and wonder when my life had stopped belonging to me. The silence from Darren was total. No apology, no explanation, not even a perfunctory, "Are you okay?" And yet, I still caught myself glancing at my phone, half hoping for his name to light up the screen. On a Tuesday morning, I decided I couldn't stand the stillness anymore. I went into the spare room, the one I'd avoided for years. It had become my dumping ground. Boxes of old papers, bags of clothes I meant to donate, half-broken furniture I couldn't quite bring myself to throw away. I told myself I was going to clean it out for more space, maybe set up a little reading nook. Really, I think I just needed something to do that didn't involve sitting alone with my thoughts. The air in that room was stale, tinged with the smell of cardboard and dust. I started with the closet, dragging out box after box. Old tax returns, expired warranties, Christmas cards from people I barely remembered. Then, at the very back, half buried under a pile of Darren's grade school art projects, I saw it. A plain brown file box with my handwriting on the side. 2 words. Financial records. My first instinct was to shove it back where I found it. I'd always been meticulous about paperwork, but I hadn't opened that box in years. It felt like looking at your own medical chart when you already know the diagnosis isn't good. Still, something in me, some restless, gnawing need, made me pull it out. I sat cross-legged on the floor and lifted the lid. Inside were neat rows of manila folders, each labeled in black ink. And as soon as I saw the first one, my stomach tightened. Darren, investment loan, 2014. I opened it, and there it was, in his own handwriting. I, Darren Mitchell, agree to repay my mother, Colleen Mitchell, the sum of $20,000 within 6 months of this date, with 3% interest. His signature was bold and confident at the bottom. I remembered writing that check, the way his eyes had shone when I handed it to him. I'd clung to the belief that it was temporary, that he'd make good on his word. He never had. Folder after folder told the same story. The $45,000 I'd given for the house down payment, his own note calling it a loan, the $15,000 for the honeymoon, with a scribbled promise to repay in 2 years. Smaller amounts, too. $2,500 here for medical bills, $5,000 there for closing costs. And then I found the one that made my hands shake, a copy of his mortgage application. Under the section for outstanding debts, in his own writing, he'd listed, personal loan from C. Mitchell, $80,000. He'd acknowledged the debt to a bank to bolster his financial profile, but never to me. To him, I wasn't a creditor who deserved repayment. I was a resource, a safety net, something to be used. The more I sifted through, the clearer it became. This wasn't a few misunderstandings or faded memories of who said what. This was a paper trail, a documented, undeniable history of him taking and never giving back. I remembered the emergency where he claimed Calliope needed specialist treatment not covered by insurance. I drained my last savings account to cover $25,000, only to see photos on her social media 2 weeks later of them sipping wine at a Napa Valley resort. When I'd asked, he'd brushed it off, said it was a gift from her parents. Now, with the papers spread out around me, I saw it for what it was. A calculated lie. I added it all up, first in my head, then on the calculator I fetched from the kitchen drawer. Documented loans alone totaled just over $83,000. That didn't even include the undocumented gifts, the countless times I'd handed over cash, covered bills, or bought things they needed without ever writing anything down. With those, the number easily crept over $130,000. My entire life savings, my retirement security. Every dream I'd had for a peaceful old age, gone, sitting in their bank account, woven into their vacations, their designer clothes, their perfect house. I sat there for a long time, the papers fanned out around me like a crime scene, my hands resting on my knees. The familiar shame started to rise in my chest, that awful tightness I'd felt at the wedding. But then something else broke through. It was cleaner, sharper, anger. Not the hot, reckless anger that makes you shout, but a steady, focused burn. The kind that makes you see things with perfect clarity. I had spent years apologizing for not having more to give, for daring to ask when I might be paid back, for existing in ways that didn't fit their world. I'd let him shape me into someone who was grateful for scraps. But looking at these documents, I realized the truth. I wasn't some pathetic old woman who couldn't manage her life. I was someone who had been systematically drained by the person I'd loved most. And I had proof. Cold, signed, dated proof. For the first time in years, I felt my spine straighten. The weight in my chest didn't disappear, but it shifted. It wasn't helplessness anymore. It was resolve. I gathered every paper, smoothed each one, and slid them back into the box in order. My hands were steady now. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing. I was done being their victim. And when I acted, I wasn't going to ask for permission. The box sat on my kitchen table for 2 days before I could bring myself to act. I'd pass by it on my way to make coffee, feeling its weight like a stone pressing on my chest. $83,000 in documented loans, $130,000 if you counted the undocumented gifts. Every figure circled back to the same truth. Darren hadn't just forgotten to pay me back. He'd never intended to. On the third morning, I woke up with the decision made. I didn't care how uncomfortable it was going to be. I didn't care if it meant he'd never speak to me again. What I cared about was the fact that I had spent 15 years allowing myself to be bled dry, and I finally had the proof to stop it. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat down at the computer, and typed, "Attorney for elder financial abuse near me." Dozens of names popped up, but one caught my eye. Margaret Henderson, 30 years in practice, specialized in family financial disputes. The photo on her website showed a woman with silver hair, a calm smile, and eyes that looked like they'd seen more than they said. Her office was in a converted Victorian downtown, painted a dignified slate blue, the kind of place that projected both warmth and authority. I made the call, and 2 days later, I was sitting in her conference room with the box in front of me. Margaret greeted me with a firm handshake. "Mrs. Mitchell, why don't you tell me what brings you here?" I hesitated for a moment. Saying it out loud felt like admitting I had failed, not just as a saver, but as a mother. Still, I opened the lid and began pulling out the folders, laying them in neat rows across her table. "These," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "are all the loans I've given my son over the last 15 years, and not a penny of it has been repaid." She listened without interrupting, her pen scratching across a yellow legal pad as I spoke. I told her about the investment loan, the honeymoon contribution, the house down payment, the emergencies that turned out to be vacations. I told her about finding his mortgage application, where he'd listed the debt to me for a bank but never acknowledged it to my face. When I finished, she picked up the first document, a signed loan agreement from 2014, and read it carefully. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is enforceable. All of these are promissory notes, checks with memos indicating loan, anything with his signature and terms. These are legally binding debts." My breath caught. "Even though he's my son?" "Especially because he's your son," she said. "Elder financial abuse often happens within families. The law doesn't make exceptions for blood relations when there's clear evidence of a loan." She flipped through more papers, setting aside a neat pile. "Based on what you've shown me, I'd estimate your documented principal at about $83,000. That doesn't include interest or the undocumented amounts you mentioned. If we pursued this in court, we could likely recover the full documented amount plus interest and attorney fees." I stared at the neat stack of paper, the ink and signatures suddenly looking sharper, heavier. "What would that involve?" "First," Margaret said, leaning back in her chair, "we send a formal demand letter. It lays out the amount owed, the documentation we have, and gives him 30 days to respond with either payment or a reasonable payment plan. If he ignores it or refuses, we file a civil lawsuit to recover the debt. With evidence this clear, I'd be very confident in your case. I felt my stomach twist. If I do this, he'll never forgive me. Margaret's gaze was steady, her voice firm. Mrs. Mitchell, may I be blunt? I nodded. Right now, you're not his mother. You're his victim. And victims don't owe their abusers the courtesy of silence. The words hit me harder than I expected. Victim. I'd spent years avoiding that label, telling myself I was just being generous, just helping my son through hard times. But sitting there in that sunlit office, surrounded by undeniable proof, I knew she was right. What if he calls me, tries to talk me out of it? I asked. Then you don't take the call, she said. All communication goes through my office from now on. That's what you're paying me for, to be the wall between you and his manipulation. I nodded slowly, feeling something shift in me. For the first time in years, I wasn't making excuses for him. I wasn't smoothing over the rough edges of his behavior in my mind. I was looking at him not as my son, but as a man who had taken from me without remorse. Margaret slid a retainer agreement across the table. My hands trembled slightly as I signed it, but not from fear. This was something else, something sharper, cleaner, resolve. We'll have the letter ready in a week, she said. Certified mail. That way we know exactly when he receives it, and exactly when the 30-day clock starts ticking. I gathered my papers back into the box, but they felt lighter now, as if transferring them to her care had shifted the burden off my shoulders. When I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the winter sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. I took a deep breath. For weeks, I had been replaying the slap, the laugh, the silence. But now, there was something new in my head. A plan. I wasn't sure how Darren would react, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. I wasn't waiting for his approval anymore. I was preparing for justice. The day after I signed the retainer agreement, I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. Darren's name was at the top of my favorites list, a position it had held for over a decade. It wasn't because he called often. He didn't. But I'd kept it there, just in case. In case he needed me. In case there was an emergency. In case he suddenly remembered I was worth talking to. My thumb hovered over the screen for a long moment before I tapped Remove from Favorites. The change was almost invisible, just a small shift on a glowing screen, but I felt it like a door closing inside me. Margaret's words from the day before echoed in my head. Right now, you're not his mother. You're his victim. If that was true, and deep down, I knew it was, then step one was to stop making myself so easy to reach. I went through every place his name lived where it didn't need to. I called my doctor's office, my bank, my insurance company. For years, Darren had been my emergency contact. I told myself it was practical. He was my only child after all. But really, it had been another tether, another way to keep him tied to me. Now I replaced his name with Helen's, my neighbor. Helen was reliable, level-headed, and most importantly, she wouldn't use an emergency as an opportunity to scold me about being a burden. With each call I made, I felt lighter. After the calls, I turned my attention to the kitchen. My freezer was packed with casseroles and soups I'd made in bulk, just in case Darren drops by. The truth was, he hadn't eaten my cooking in over 2 years. He'd always have an excuse. Some new diet, some dinner already planned. I stood there staring at those foil-wrapped dishes, each one a quiet offering that had never been accepted, and I realized they were just taking up space. I stacked them into a garbage bag and carried them out to the bin. The shelves looked bare when I was done, but they also looked like mine again. I wouldn't be cooking for a ghost anymore. The living room was next. Every surface was crowded with framed photos of Darren. Graduations, birthdays, vacations. In most of them, I was behind the camera, absent from the picture but responsible for making it happen. I didn't want to erase him completely. I wasn't ready for that. But I started removing the duplicates, the ones that were more about milestones than memories. I wrapped them carefully and stored them in a box, leaving a few that still made me smile. The room felt different almost immediately. Less like a shrine, more like a home. And then there was the phone. For years, I'd kept the ringer on loud day and night. I told myself it was because I lived alone and needed to be reachable, but the real reason was simpler. I didn't want to miss Darren if he called. Now, with the demand letter being prepared and Margaret handling all communication, there was no reason to keep living on edge. That night, for the first time in years, I switched my phone to silent after 9 p.m. The first evening felt wrong, like I was abandoning my post. I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, fighting the urge to pick up the phone just to make sure it still worked. But nothing happened. No call, no text, no emergency. By the third night, I realized how much better I was sleeping without the anxiety of waiting for his name to appear. It was a strange thing, how quickly the absence of something could become a kind of peace. For so long, the silence between us had felt like a punishment, a cold shoulder I was desperate to thaw. Now, with each day that passed without a word, I started to see it differently. Silence didn't have to be emptiness. It could be space. Space to think, to breathe, to remember who I was before my life revolved around someone else's needs. I filled that space with small things at first. A morning walk around the block. An extra half hour with my coffee, reading a book instead of scrolling through old photos. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd always thought about but never done, because it didn't fit Darren's schedule. I started buying groceries for one without feeling guilty, picking up little treats I liked instead of things I thought he might want if he stopped by. The shift was subtle, but powerful. For years, I had been on standby, like an appliance plugged in and ready, just waiting for someone to press the button. Now I was learning how to run on my own power. And the strangest part? The less I thought about when or if he might call, the less it seemed to matter. I wasn't cured of the hurt. I still had moments when I'd glance at the phone, expecting to see his name. I still caught myself imagining what I'd say if he reached out with something real. A genuine apology, maybe, or even just a simple, "How are you?" But those moments passed more quickly now, and they no longer dictated my whole day. The space I was creating wasn't just physical, empty freezer shelves, bare spots on the mantle. It was mental, emotional. And in that space, something new was growing. Not anger, though I still felt it. Not sadness, though that would always be part of it. What I felt most was a kind of quiet readiness. I didn't know exactly what was coming when the letter went out, but I knew I'd be able to face it without flinching. The silence had stopped being a void I needed to fill. It had become the room I needed to stand tall. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was at the little coffee shop 2 blocks from my house, reading a novel I'd bought on impulse. I'd started going there since cutting Darren off, savoring the small luxury of sitting in public without feeling rushed, without keeping one eye on the clock in case someone needed me. My phone buzzed with a call from Helen, my neighbor. "Colleen," she said, her voice low like she was sharing a secret. "There's a young woman sitting in a white BMW in your driveway. Says she's your daughter-in-law. Been there over an hour." My stomach clenched, but not with the old, familiar anxiety. This was something different. Anticipation. "Thanks for letting me know, Helen," I said. "I'll be home in a few minutes." I wasn't at the store like she probably assumed. I was sipping my coffee, turning another page, letting Calliope wait. By the time I pulled into my driveway, she was leaning against the car, scrolling her phone with that practiced air of someone accustomed to having the world wait for her. She straightened when she saw me, a smile already plastered on her face. "Colleen," she said brightly. "I was hoping we could talk." I took my time gathering my purse and the book from the passenger seat. "About what? The wedding?" She smoothed a strand of highlighted hair behind her ear. "I think there might have been some misunderstandings. Emotions were running high. It was a stressful day for everyone." I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, leaving it open behind me. She followed, her heels clicking on the hardwood. In my modest living room, surrounded by my unfashionable but comfortable furniture, she looked out of place, like a magazine model dropped into the wrong set. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, playing the hostess role I'd learned long ago. "Water would be nice," she said, perching on the edge of the couch as if afraid to crease her clothes. I took my time in the kitchen, filling a glass with ice water, adding a plate of crackers I knew she wouldn't touch. When I returned, she was glancing around at the family photos, her gaze lingering on Darren's face in each one. "So many pictures of Darren," she remarked, accepting the water. "You must miss having him around more." It was a fishing expedition, and I wasn't biting. "Actually, I've been quite busy," I said, settling into my armchair. "Taking classes, reading more. Amazing how much time you have when you're not constantly worrying about other people's problems." Her smile flickered, but didn't fully break. "That's wonderful. Self-care is important. Between us, I think Darren feels terrible about what happened. He's just too proud to reach out first." I tilted my head. "What exactly does he feel terrible about?" She blinked, clearly not, expecting to be challenged. "Well, you know, the situation, the stress. So he feels bad about laughing when you slapped me?" The question hung in the air like a bell. A faint flush crept up her neck. "Colleen, you have to understand. Norma's gown was incredibly expensive." I kept my tone even. "And you assaulted a 65-year-old woman over an accident, and my son found it amusing. Which part exactly is he sorry for?" She set down her glass, hands tightening in her lap. "I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. I came to apologize, to try to make things right." "Did you?" I asked. "Because what I heard was an explanation of why your behavior was understandable, and a suggestion that Darren is too proud to apologize." Her eyes darted toward the doorway, and I knew why before I even heard the car pull up. Darren walked in without knocking, like he still lived here. He stopped short when he saw us. "Mom," he said carefully, "Callie said you two were talking." "We were discussing her apology," I replied, though I'm still waiting to hear it. His jaw tightened. "I think we're all a little emotional here. Maybe we should take a step back." "I'm not emotional," I said calmly. "Calmer than I've been in years." He moved to stand behind Calliope, his hands resting on her shoulders, a show of unity. "Look, what happened at the wedding was unfortunate. Accidents happen. We all react differently under stress." I nodded. "You're right. Accidents do happen, like me accidentally discovering some very interesting documents while cleaning last week." His eyes flickered. "What kind of documents?" "Oh, just old paperwork. Loan agreements, promissory notes, things I'd forgotten I had." I smiled faintly. Amazing how different they look when you review them with fresh eyes. Darren's face paled. Calliope looked between us, sensing the change but not understanding it. "If this is about money," he began. "Why would it be about money?" I interrupted. "You've always said family doesn't keep score." The silence stretched, He was calculating now, weighing what I knew against what I might be willing to do. Finally, he said, "Maybe we should continue this another time." "Maybe you should leave," I said. It was the first time in 20 years I'd told my son to leave my house. Calliope stood abruptly, heels clicking toward the door. Darren hesitated, clearly wanting to salvage control, but my silence made the choice for him. They left without another word, and through the window I watched them in the driveway, their conversation tight and urgent. Darren kept glancing back at my house. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one shrinking under his gaze. I was the one holding the ground. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday morning. Margaret read it to me over the phone before sending it. Crisp, professional, and unmistakably serious. It detailed every documented loan, the total principal of $83,247, and the 30-day deadline to either pay in full or arrange a reasonable payment plan. "Certified mail," she reminded me. "We'll know exactly when he receives it and exactly when the clock starts." By mid-afternoon, I had the confirmation email from the post office. Delivered, signed for. At 10:47 a.m., Darren Mitchell officially knew his mother wasn't asking anymore. She was demanding. I half expected the phone to ring immediately, but the silence lasted just long enough for me to wonder if he'd surprise me with maturity. That hope didn't survive past lunch. By 11:15, my phone was buzzing nonstop. First came the angry voicemail. "Mom, what the hell is this? You're seriously trying to sue me? This is insane. Call me back right now." Then, barely 20 minutes later, a softer tone. "Look, I think we need to talk about this before you do something you can't undo. You don't want to drag the family into court." By early afternoon, it had shifted into pleading. "Mom, please. We can work something out. You know I'll take care of you." I didn't answer any of them. Margaret had been clear. No direct contact. Everything went through her office now. Still, it's one thing to agree to that in a lawyer's conference room, and another to watch your phone light up with your child's name over and over, the number climbing past 20 missed calls in a single day. That evening, Helen called to check in. "He was here," she said simply. "Banged on your door for a good 5 minutes. I told him you weren't receiving visitors." I imagined her standing there, small but unyielding, facing down a man 6 inches taller than her. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than I could express. "Anytime," she replied. "I don't like the way he talks to you." The visits escalated over the next week. The day after Helen's call, Darren showed up again, pounding hard enough that the pictures on my wall rattled. "I know you're in there," he shouted. "Your car's in the driveway." I stood in my kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, listening to his voice carry through the door. After a few minutes, Helen's screen door creaked open. "She's not seeing you today," she called out. "Go home." His tone dropped immediately. "Helen, have you seen my mom? I just want to talk." "You can talk, through her attorney," she said. I smiled into my mug. By the end of the first week, Calliope made her appearance, dressed in a designer coat and holding a tissue she dabbed delicately at her eyes. She parked in my driveway and called up to my front window. "Colleen, please, you're tearing the family apart." I opened the window just enough to speak through. "The same way you tore my dignity apart at your wedding?" She blinked, caught off guard. "That's not the same thing." "You're right," I said evenly. "Your dress cost $45,000. What I'm asking for is only $83,000. Such a bargain, really." Her jaw tightened. I closed the window before she could recover. After that, the tactics got more creative. One afternoon, a cousin I hadn't heard from in years left a message saying he'd been asked to mediate between Darren and me. as though this were some petty disagreement instead of a financial betrayal. Another time, Darren sent flowers with a card that read, "We can fix this. Love always." I left them on the porch until they wilted. Every day, the 30-day clock ticked forward. Margaret checked in twice a week, her calm voice reminding me that this barrage wasn't a sign of power. It was a sign of fear. "They're trying everything but the obvious solution," she said, "paying you back." The strangest part was the shift happening inside me. The first couple of days, the calls and visits made my hands shake. By the end of the second week, I was making lunch while Darren pounded on my door like a door-to-door salesman I had no interest in speaking to. The urgency in his voice no longer pulled at me. It rolled off like water on glass. Helen became my unofficial gatekeeper, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes each time she turned him away. "You're getting your spine back," she told me one afternoon as we chatted over the fence. "Feels good, doesn't it?" "Better than I expected," I admitted. The call slowed in the third week, not because they'd given up, but because I think they finally realized I wasn't going to break. Every time my phone buzzed, I sent the missed call log straight to Margaret. Every knock at my door went unanswered. And with each passing day, the silence between knocks grew longer until it wasn't silence anymore. It was space. Space I'd carved out and claimed for myself. Space where I could breathe without waiting for the next demand. The 30-day clock was still running, but for the first time in years, so was my life. On the 21st day after the demand letter landed, Margaret called me with an update. "Your son has hired an attorney," she said, her voice steady as ever. "Name's David Brennan, Brennan Kowalski and Associates. He reached out this morning." I felt the corner of my mouth twitch in something that wasn't quite a smile. "So, he's not planning to just pay what he owes?" "If he was," Margaret replied, "he wouldn't be paying someone else to fight it." That afternoon, Brennan himself called me. "Mrs. Mitchell," he began in a tone so smooth it almost sounded like concern. "I'm representing your son in this matter. Perhaps we could resolve this without dragging the courts into it. Family disputes are always better handled privately." "You'll need to speak with my attorney," I said, cutting him off. "Margaret Henderson, Henderson and Associates." "Of course," he said quickly. "But before we involve—" "We're already involved," I interrupted. If Darren wanted to handle this privately, he had 15 years and $83,000 worth of opportunities. There was a pause, and then he shifted gears. "This kind of litigation can be expensive, public. Surely that's not what you want for your family's reputation." I almost laughed. My son stopped being my family the moment he laughed while his wife humiliated me. Now he's just someone who owes me money. I hung up before he could respond. Within the week, Margaret filed the paperwork for a civil suit. The date on the documents felt like a line in the sand. No more, "Maybe they'll come to their senses." No more, "What if I'm being too harsh?" We were past the point of no return. And Darren knew it. What followed were 8 months of pressure campaigns so predictable I could have written the playbook myself. The calls ramped up again, not from him, but from people I barely spoke to anymore. An aunt who just wanted to understand why I was doing this to my son. A family friend who'd heard the rumors and wanted to know if there was any way to walk it back. Each one couched their words in concern, but the message was always the same. "You're making a scene. You're supposed to keep family business in the family." I stopped explaining myself after the first month. "All communication goes through my attorney," became my default response. It was amazing how quickly people lost interest when they realized they couldn't wring a confession or a compromise out of me. Then came the gifts. Flowers on Mother's Day with a card that read, "We can start over," a bottle of wine from a vineyard in Napa, the same one they'd visited during that medical emergency years ago. I left it all. Untouched, a silent message that I wasn't for sale. The hardest were the appearances. Twice, Darren showed up at my house unannounced, not pounding this time but knocking softly, like the sound alone could make him seem less dangerous. Both times, I stood in the kitchen until he left. Once he sat in his car for over an hour, engine idling as if waiting me out. Helen texted me updates from her front window. Still there, still looking angry. If he thought guilt or intimidation would work, he didn't understand that those tools only functioned if I opened the door. Margaret kept me informed about the legal side of things, motions filed, discovery deadlines, back and forth with Brennan. They keep trying to settle verbally, she told me one afternoon, lowballing you with offers that don't even cover half the documented debt. And you told them? I asked. That you'll see them in court, she said, her voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. The truth was, I could have settled early for a smaller amount. Margaret even said so. Practically, it might save time, avoid stress. But every time I considered it, I pictured the look on Darren's face at the wedding. That smirk, that laugh. The easy way he tossed me to the wolves because it was convenient. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about teaching him, maybe for the first time, that there were consequences. The months dragged, each side building their case. Darren's lawyer tried to argue that some of the loans were gifts, that family contributions shouldn't be treated like business transactions. Margaret demolished that with the signed agreements, the memos on checks, even the mortgage application where Darren himself had listed the debt. This isn't going away for him, she told me. He'll fight, but unless he comes up with a real settlement, we'll take it all the way. And through it all, I held firm. I didn't answer calls. I didn't respond to letters unless Margaret drafted them. I didn't let anyone lure me into a conversation off the record. The distance that used to feel like punishment now felt like armor. Every tactic they tried, guilt, charm, intimidation, bounced off. Not because I was unfeeling, but because I finally understood the cost of letting those tactics work. On the morning of our pre-trial conference, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized something had changed. I didn't look like a woman waiting for her son to remember she mattered. I looked like a woman who mattered whether he remembered or not. The suit was still underway, but I'd already won something far more valuable than a judgment. I'd reclaimed my voice, and I wasn't giving it back. The mediation room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon-scented cleaning spray, the kind of sterile mix that tells you nothing human really happens here, just transactions. The table was long and narrow, with me and Margaret on one side, Darren and his lawyer Brennan on the other. He was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, the kind you wear to look unshakable, but I noticed the faint lines etched deeper into his forehead since the wedding. Brennan started the way I imagine he always does, with a lowball. My client is prepared to offer $30,000 to settle this matter today and put it behind both families. Margaret didn't even glance at me. Full amount owed plus interest and attorney fees, $97,412, she said, her voice like a gavel. Darren's head jerked toward her. That's impossible. I don't have that kind of cash. You had it when you took it from your mother, Margaret replied smoothly. Figure it out. Brennan leaned forward. Mrs. Mitchell, surely you understand that an extended payment battle will only cause more strain on your family relationships. Isn't there a middle ground? I looked him straight in the eye. The middle ground was the last 15 years of my life. We're past that now. The negotiation dragged for hours. They tried every angle, emotional appeals, veiled threats about how public the court case could become, even suggesting some of the loans were symbolic and shouldn't count as debt. Margaret countered each point with calm precision, sliding documents across the table like chess pieces, the signed agreements, the check memos, the mortgage application where Darren himself had listed the debt. By the fourth hour, Darren's posture had changed. He'd started the day leaning back, one arm draped casually along the chair. Now he was hunched forward, his jaw tight, eyes flicking from me to Margaret like he was looking for an escape route. $50,000 up front, Brennan finally said, and the rest over time. $2,000 a month for 24 months. We'll secure it against his property. Margaret looked at me, giving me the final say. I nodded. As long as the collateral is in place, she confirmed. If a payment is missed, the full remaining balance is due immediately. Brennan agreed. Darren signed the settlement papers with a pen that clicked too many times in his hand. When it was my turn, my hand was steady. As the final signatures were exchanged, Darren looked at me for the first time that day. Not the quick glances he'd been throwing, but a full, steady look. And in his eyes I saw something I'd never seen before. Not love, not even guilt. Respect. It was grudging, reluctant, but it was there. The kind you give to an opponent who has proven themselves capable of winning. Was it worth it? He asked quietly, as Brennan gathered the papers. Destroying our relationship over money? I met his gaze without flinching. I didn't destroy anything, Darren. I just stopped pretending it existed. Margaret closed her briefcase with a snap. We're done here. We walked out into the cold February air, the sky low and gray. I half expected to feel elated, triumphant, something big enough to match the size of the check I was about to receive. But what I felt was lighter. Not free. Not yet, but lighter. The settlement wasn't just about the money. It was proof that I could stand up for myself, that I could draw a line and hold it, even against the person I'd once thought I'd protect forever. The first payment, the $50,000 lump sum, arrived exactly on schedule 2 weeks later. I deposited it without ceremony, then used part of it to book a trip I dreamed about for decades. The rest went into an account with my name alone on it. No co-signers, no emergency access for family. The monthly payments started arriving like clockwork, $2,000 at a time, each one a small reminder that consequences still existed in Darren's world. He never missed one, which told me all I needed to know. He'd always had the means to repay me. He'd simply chosen not to, until I forced his hand. The respect I'd seen in his eyes during mediation didn't translate into phone calls or holiday invitations. We didn't reconcile, and I stopped hoping we would. That day in the mediation room had shifted something permanent between us. He no longer saw me as a soft place to land or a wallet he could open without asking. And I no longer saw him as the boy I'd raised. He was just a man who owed me money. And now he was paying it back. Walking out of that building with Margaret at my side, I realized that some victories aren't about repair. They're about closure. And I'd just closed the door on the last 15 years of my life. The $50,000 lump sum cleared into my account on a Thursday morning. I watched the numbers shift on the screen, a digital confirmation that everything Margaret and I had fought for was real. There was no rush of triumph, no giddy laughter, just a deep, steady satisfaction. For the first time in years, I had money in my account that wasn't already earmarked for someone else's needs. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and booked the trip I'd been quietly dreaming about for decades. Ireland. A month-long stay in small bed and breakfasts, winding along the coast, exploring ancient castles, hearing music spill from pub doorways into the cool night air. It was the trip I'd always promised myself, someday, back when someday depended on someone else's approval. Now it was mine, paid for in full with money my son had once sworn I'd never see again. Ireland was everything I'd hoped for and more. I walked cobblestone streets in Galway, listened to fiddle tunes in Dingle, stood on the cliffs of Moher with the wind tangling my hair. In a pub in County Cork, I met Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher from Dublin traveling solo for the first time since her husband passed. We ended up spending 3 days together, wandering through green hills and laughing over pints like old friends. On our last evening, she asked if I had family back in the States. I told her, for the first time without hesitation or shame, I have a son, but we're not close. The words felt clean, unweighted. Her only response was a gentle nod, as if she understood without needing the story. Before we parted, she mentioned she'd like to visit America someday. I told her my guest room was hers if she ever did. We meant it. When I came home, the house felt different. Not because it had changed, but because I had. The first weekend back, I pulled down half the old photographs of Darren that had once covered every wall and shelf. I left a few that still made me smile. Him as a boy, gap-toothed and laughing, but the rest went into a box in the closet. In their place, I hung pictures from my travels, the sun breaking over the Wicklow Mountains, Eleanor and I grinning in front of a crumbling stone tower, the swirling colors of a market in Galway. I repainted the living room in a warm, deep green, the color of the fields I'd walked through, and replaced the heavy drapes with light linen that let the sun spill in. My home no longer looked like a shrine to a relationship I'd been trying to save. It looked like the home of a woman living her own life. The monthly payments came without fail, $2,000 on the first of every month. I didn't spend them right away. Some went into savings, some into a small fund for more travel, and some into little luxuries I used to talk myself out of. Flowers for my kitchen table, a good set of watercolor paints, dinner with friends without checking the price column first. Each payment was less about the money and more about what it represented. That for the first time in years, I was not being ignored, brushed aside, or taken for granted. I was being paid what I was owed, in every sense of the word. 24 months later, the final payment arrived. Along with it came a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. In Darren's handwriting, debt paid in full. I read it once, then dropped it straight into the trash. Some debts could never really be paid, not with money, not with words. And some closures didn't need souvenirs. What mattered was that the ledger was done. The last tie between us, the only one he'd maintained for the past 2 years, was cut. There was no call, no letter, no attempt at reconciliation. I didn't expect one. Our relationship had survived only as a balance sheet, and now even that was gone. But the space it left behind was something I couldn't have imagined 2 years earlier. Freedom. Not the kind you announce with fireworks, but the quiet, steady kind you feel when you wake up in the morning and realize you're living entirely on your own terms. I didn't need his approval, his presence, or his excuses. I didn't need the illusion of closeness that cost me my savings, my dignity, and my peace of mind. What I had instead was a home that felt like mine, a passport with stamps I'd earned, and a future I didn't have to ask permission to shape. Eleanor did visit, just as she'd promised. We spent 2 weeks touring the wine country, hiking in national parks, and laughing late into the night over pots of tea. She left me with an open invitation to her place in Dublin, and we're already planning our next trip together. Life, it turns out, is full of possibilities when you're not weighed down by people who see you as a resource instead of a person. If you've stayed with me through this story, you probably already know the question I'm about to ask you. What would you do if someone you loved turned your generosity into a ledger and your trust into a game they knew they could win? Would you keep paying the price for the sake of family? Or would you decide, like I finally did, that freedom is worth more than the illusion of love? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories like this, about taking your life back when someone has taken too much, There are two waiting for you on the screen right now.